Okay, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. I'll introduce myself. So my name is Tali Berner. I teach at the program in Child and Youth Research at Tel Aviv University. I'm a historian of early modern Ashkenaz, and I specialize in the lives of children and family and community in early modern Europe. I'm happy to be here at the reading room at the National Library of Jerusalem, a place that I consider home or a second home. And one of the hardest thing about this pandemic is that we were not able to be in the library for long periods. Thankfully, we're back, but this is a great opportunity here to see people from close and afar and talk about my favorite topics. So I would like to thank the library for inviting me and you for being here tonight. So when we think about children in the past, and especially about Jewish children in the past, we tend to think about the boys who spent long hours in the cheder, poring over their gemarot. We think about children working side by side their parents in the workshop, or girls tending to younger siblings and doing household chores. We seldom associate play, pastime, and children's culture to childhoods of the past. Yet, I would like to argue that there's much evidence from past societies to the fact that children played, had their own toys, and a rich culture of their own. Some of you might be familiar with the name of the French historian Philippe Ariès. In 1960, Ariès published a groundbreaking work about children in medieval and early modern France. In his book, Ariès argues that childhood, as we know it, is a modern construction that first appeared in the 18th century. Before that, he claimed, childhood was not a social or cultural category, or if it existed, it had little meaning or little content. Children were considered small adults, and had a very short childhood. And parents, adults, were at the best indifferent to children, to their own children, and did not invest much in their lives. This theory or this argument had become very popular and is still held as truth in by some people and in some fields of research. But for the past 40 years, I think historians have managed to prove that Ariès misinterpreted his sources or looked at a very small number of sources. And indeed, children in the past, in the Middle Ages, in every past society that we're familiar with and has been researched, indeed had a rich childhood. Parents invested much in their children, and society in general recognized the category of childhood and the category of youth as an important and meaningful part of life. And this is true for Jewish children in the past as well, both in medieval and early modern Europe. And what I would like to show today is not only that, of course, children existed in the past and children were part of the family, they worked, they learned, but they also had their own culture, their own customs, their own ways of celebrating, their own games and toys. And those were recognized by society, by rabbis, by community leaders in general. So children's games and toys are as ancient as culture, as far as we know. And toys were found in archaeological diggings and all over the world. And games are described and mentioned in different sources. And you can see here, I brought because we're here in Jerusalem, I brought the famous verses from the book of Zechariah, talking about the end of the days and what symbolizes peace. And there will be old men and old women in the streets of Jerusalem, each with their cane in hand due to their advanced age. And the streets of the city will be crowded with boys and girls playing in the streets. So we can see here that children playing in the streets is a symbol of prosperity, of peace, and we might also say in these days a sign of normality of what people should be doing and how life and the world should look like. And before I begin,
Dr. Berner, could you please enlarge the presentation?
Oh, yes.
Thank you. Sorry.
Children's games and toys were also depicted in art. I brought here the famous painting by the painter Bruegel from 1560. Children's games, and it's full of details. I encourage those who are not familiar with it to search for it and look at it later. But there are dozens and dozens of games here. Some of them we recognize and we're familiar with. Some are less. We can see here sticks and hoops and balls and spinning tops. We can see children playing hide and seek, catch, girls dancing. We have masks, children dressing up as monks, as brides, and many other kinds of activities and pastimes that we associate with children and childhood today as well. So what can we say about Jewish children and their games in particular? So we might want to ask ourselves, how can we, what sources do we have? Who documented and described what Jewish children played with in the past? We know that children rarely wrote, and if they did, the writings did not survive. We have autobiographical documents of adults describing their childhood, which sometimes they refer to, and we will see some of these quotes later, their habits and what they did as children. But these games and toys are mentioned in surprising places where we would not expect to find them, and mostly in halachic literature, in Jewish law. And this is the context in which they're described and discussed, which is important to understand in order to understand the sources that we will see in this lecture. So I would like to begin with the beginning of life, with babies, the material culture, we would say, of infants and toddlers. What can we say about that, and what do we know belonged to children? What did they use? What did they play with? What did babies have and use? So I will start with a discussion from the Babylonian Talmud in the context of the laws of purity and of Shabbat. There are many objects that are mentioned there. Among them, there's one object called in Hebrew Agala Shel Katan, a child's wagon. And the Torah says the following. Child's wagon is susceptible to the ritual impurity imprinted by trending weight. Rabbi Yehuda says, no vessels may be dragged along the ground on Shabbat except a wagon, because it only compresses the earth. Compresses, yes, but it does not make a fur. Okay, so what is this object, a child's wagon. Now, if you could open your microphones, I think, or I would ask you to Google and show me a picture of what you think a child's wagon is. I imagine that most of you would send me a picture or say that it's probably a stroller, right? And Rashi, the medieval commentator, says the following: a child's wagon that they made for him to play with, or on which he sits and is carried. Okay, so on which he sits and is carried. Is it this object? As I said, the stroller. You can see a pre-modern one, a modern one. The only problem with this is that, as far as we know, the stroller was invented in the 18th century. So this is probably not what the Talmud and Rashi are talking about. And indeed, the Tosafot, also the medieval commentators, they're not quite sure what Rashi is talking about. Okay, just a generation later. A child's wagon. Rashi explains that the child sits in it, but it does not make sense that there is no such special device. Therefore, it seems to me that this is a device made for children to learn how to walk. It stands on 3 wheels and he holds it with his hands and it rolls in front of him. Okay, so we have quite a detailed description here of something that I think most of us is familiar with, although this has fallen out of use. Today it's deemed as something that is not it's not good for babies' development, but it definitely we have rich documentation of the walker. It appears again and again from Greek pottery to domestic scenes of either Jesus or other regular families, children walking and pushing 3 or 4-wheeled object that they learn to walk with. And obviously, both the Tosafot were definitely familiar with this and identify this object as something that seems to have been quite popular and quite associated with a certain stage of infancy or childhood, as we can see in the scene. A family with children of different ages. We can see the baby in the crib and then the walking toddler. And here's another depiction of it. Again, the child walking. So we've seen a walker, we've ruled out a stroller, but Rashi also mentions the possibility that this is something that children play with. And indeed, we in Greek pottery, which we might assume that the Gemara was familiar with similar objects, we see different kinds of wheeled carts that might have been part of children's culture as well. But as the Tosafot say, this is not a special device for children, and this is maybe why they thought that Rashi misinterpreted this one. Another possibility is, of course, these wheeled toys that were found in archaeological diggings all over the world and are very associated with childhood, usually depicting a certain animal, but not necessarily. So children grow, and we move on to the main part of childhood, which I will dedicate most of my time in this lecture to discuss. So what did Jewish children play with and when? Which is an important question, because although I said that we assume that they did not spend all their day learning or working, they spent a great deal of their day either working or learning or helping their parents with the household chores or in the business. It left them very little time really for play during weekdays. So we can assume that they played mostly on Shabbat and holidays. And here, the documentation comes when there is some kind of problem or contradiction or issue, halachic issue, that raises from the fact that Shabbat and holidays have their many different laws. So the first category I would like to discuss is ball games. Ball games are also one of the more universal types of children's play. They're mentioned also in the Talmud as something mostly associated with the Hellenistic world, and usually seen in a negative way. But nevertheless, we find Jewish children playing with balls. And in the 16th century, the Maharshal, the commentator and rabbinical authority, discusses the playing ball during Yom Tov, during holidays. And he says the following, I'm reading here. And it is surprising that it should be permissible to play ball games on Yom Tov, since this is not a necessity of Yom Tov at all. But since it is for the amusement of children who have not reached the age of requirement for mitzvot, it is allowed. But for older people, this seems to me a bad custom, since it is not a form of pastime, of legitimate pastime, but rather children's conversation and frivolity. Okay, so the Maharshal here seems to relate to a reality, just a certain reality that he's familiar with, that people, including adults, it seems, play ball on holidays. But maybe it's even more associated with children. And for him, this is not something that somebody should do on the holiday, probably because this is not deemed serious or fitting within the nature or of the holiday. But nevertheless, he says, this is for the amusement of children. Okay, he identifies a category here that we will see later said in different ways, for the amusement of children, or as I titled the lecture, for the pleasures of baby. This comes in many forms, and he puts a line here between what is appropriate for adults and what is appropriate for children. And it's not, the way I understand it, it's not only the fact that children under 13 or under 12 have not reached the age of legal maturity and are not required to adhere to all the commandments. It is an understanding, I think, of the nature of children, of what makes children happy on the holiday, and a way to make a distinction between what is appropriate for children and what is appropriate for adults. And we can see here, and we will see again, a recognition of the different nature of children and what fits children. Okay, so here he talks in general about ball games. We don't know what exactly he's talking about. Let's move on and see if we can see more specific, identify more specific games. Again, this source comes from Italy, again from the 16th century, in a response discussing a specific kind of game that I think you will identify. On Shabbat and holidays, within and without and outside the city, and even in a house in the field, in a designated area for ball playing, boys will throw it, catch it with a mitt or with a string basket, This is in a place where these were rented at a fixed rate. So I believe he describes here something that we might recognize as tennis or something similar to tennis. And he describes at length. I only brought here a short quote. This game included renting a special field, paying in advance, going sometimes out of the city, and for those familiar with the laws of Shabbat and holidays, there are many multiple problems that arise from this habit. But nevertheless, he discusses this as something that young people do on Shabbat and holidays, and it is not necessarily not permitted. So we can see here again how the description and even the need to go into detail in describing what exactly this game involves is part of a halachic discussion, and thanks to that we were able to learn about these games and what place they took in the culture of the community in general, and the culture of children in particular, and the ways that children enjoy themselves and their free time. The next category I would like to talk about has to do with the play with fruit and nuts, as a representation of the ways that children use natural objects, objects that were available to them and in their surrounding and around them. We have many stories of childhood from Augustine to Rousseau concerning picking fruits, stealing fruits from trees that didn't belong to them, throwing fruits and nuts. If we look at the illustration here, this was made by a non-Jew describing the holiday of Simchat Torah and the custom of throwing fruits and nuts to children. I think that many of us who are familiar with the modern custom, today we don't throw fruits and nuts, we throw candy at children, either at the bar mitzvah boy or at the first day of school, and this sort of throwing fruits and nuts or candy from above, as if it comes from either from heaven or from an angel from the sky, as a sign of prosperity, of happiness. It is a recurring theme in the history of Jewish children. We find it on many occasions in medieval and early modern history, and we can see here. And if you look at this illustration, we can see the children bending down to pick them. Maybe there might be two children fighting over candies down here. And it seems that they're having a good time playing with this, but as we will see, this was only the first stage of what children did with these fruits and nuts that they received. Apparently, they seem to become something to play, an object to play with. I'm reading here from the custom books of Maharil, 15th century legal halachic authority and rabbi from the community of Worms in Germany. And here again, he describes a very specific way of playing with nuts. That game played by young boys and girls on Shabbat, rolling nuts. in which one whose nut touches that of his friend gets them all, should be forbidden on Shabbat. But who will protest to those I proclaim that it is better that they should sin unwittingly rather than purposefully? Okay, so this we can draw a line between what we saw at the beginning with the Maharshal and his discussion of ball games and the discussion here of playing with nuts. Again, he is not very happy with the way this is played on Shabbat, and he believes it infringes of some laws of Shabbat. But he hesitates to say something about it. He hesitates to intervene here. And in a very typical way of when legal authorities, rabbinical authorities feel that they cannot, they don't have the power to stop a certain kind of behavior, they decide to remain silent and not say anything about it. So the ones who are participating in a specific activity will not be sinning purposefully, rather than acting from not knowing what it should be. So that's how he explains his stance and how we might understand it. But we can also go back to the claim of the Maharshal about the amusement of children and what makes children happy on Shabbat and on holidays is playing games, and we cannot stop them from doing what I imagine the Maharil sees as the normal thing for children to do when they have free time, when they get together, when they have nuts available to play with, is to play with these nuts. And we can see him following the same kind of argument on a discussion about Yom Kippur. Apparently, these games were not restricted to Shabbat and holidays, but even played on the holiest day of the year, on Yom Kippur. And he makes a very interesting argument here, I believe. The custom of boys to play with nuts on Yom Kippur causes them distress and anguish, as it is painful for them to play with them and yet not be permitted to eat from them, thus keeping mandated of you must torture yourself on Yom Kippur. Okay, so I think he makes a very interesting argument, sort of apologetic way of explaining what children did. That the fact that they play with nuts and are unable to eat them causes them distress and anguish, which also we can learn from here that they eventually ate the nuts that they played with. But I think that one might also assume that it did not only cause them distress and anguish playing with nuts, and they might have also enjoyed the game itself, even though they were not able to eat the nuts at the end of the game. So again, we see this attempt to permit things that are not quite halachically permissible, and to allow children to sort of act in the ways that they understand as the ways that children should act in, or what is natural for children. So we saw ball games, we saw nuts and fruit that are almost universal, can be found in many cultures, children playing with these sorts of games. But there are also games that are more specific, Jewishly specific, and are more connected to Jewish traditions and what is done on holidays. We can see here again, this time from Italy, the custom of giving out fruits and nuts on Simchat Torah. But also, and I apologize for the quality, but this is almost as good as the original. Children here, on the bottom, we can see children on the holiday of Purim. You can see almost all the children in this illustration are holding things that might look like, I assume, are rattles or hammers of some kind, beating Haman on Purim, which is one of the more popular traditions associated with children on the holidays. But we can find other traditions that have to do with other holidays, none of that was less familiar with them. And here again, 15th century, the Leket Yosher. One must not leave small children to play near the Hanukkah candles, even if there is not a mandate to stop them. In any event, this is not publicizing the miracle, since it is typical of children to light candles for play. So the Leket Yosher might be talking about two different things here, or might be one that is two that are one. But we see here one halachic problem with children playing near the Hanukkah candles, using the light to play, right? Which is not permissible. You're not supposed to use the Hanukkah lights for any activities, to read or to work or to play with. The Hanukkah candles are there to publicize the miracle, not to use as light. So he says that children, although they're not mandated, they're not halachically, legally obligated to keep that rule, nevertheless, one should not let children play near the Hanukkah candles. But he also mentions the possibility that children light candles to play with. So do children imitate adults and light their own candles? Only their candles are not the real Hanukkah candles. They're not the ones that one is supposed to use to publicize the miracle. And there's some kind of confusion between the ones that are lit by children and the ones that are lit by adults. So maybe children should not play with Hanukkah candles near the ones that adults play with. And in any case, what we can see here is, again, this saying that there's something that children do, something that is associated, something that is typical of children, to light candles for play on the holiday of Hanukkah, imitating or walking in the ways of the adults, doing what the adults did in their own way and celebrating the holiday. And again, to the holiday of Purim. And here from the 18th century, this is our latest source, from the autobiographical book, Samuel, of the false Messiah, Yaakov Frank, The Words of the Lord. The book, by the way, is full of childhood stories and of sayings, and he relates a lot to his own childhood, whether the stories that he tells there actually happened or not. Given the nature of the personality of the person we're talking about, I find it hard to believe in many cases. Some of the stories he tells seems to be unlikely to have happened. But this story about the holiday of Purim we can assume he relates here to something that his audience is familiar with. When I was little, I myself would make as if to play the game of the game that Jews enjoyed, which they called Achashverosh. I assume playing the Book of Esther. Having made up in a garment of paper and wood mats, I myself would be Mordechai, Haman, and his wife Zeresh. So he describes here a one-man show, right? He plays all the different characters of the Book of Esther, of the Megillah. I assume that he's referring here to the fact that he himself has played many personalities, had many phases in the world. He was the good and the bad, and the male and the female. So he's saying here something about himself as an adult, but he definitely relates here to something, as I said, that his audience is familiar with, the custom of children to put up plays on the holiday of Purim. And one last holiday I will mention here is Lag BaOmer. The holiday of Lag BaOmer, which as far as Jewish tradition is a rather minor holiday, was a big holiday for children. The reason was that it's one of the 3 days during the school year, which is not a holiday, a Yom Tov or Chanukah or Purim, where there is a break from school, from the cheder, the chedarim, and the yeshivot. Had a day off on Lag BaOmer, Tu B'Av, the 15th of Av, and the 15th of Shvat, Tu B'Shvat. On these days, the melamdim, the teachers, and the rabbis gave cake to the children, and it was a day of sort of free play and much joy. And we have a description here from a story. This is translated from the Yiddish, Meise von Worms. One day, on the day known as Lag BaOmer, when the young men were very happy and they played a game known in German as Kogi Bargilis, it is played thus. One bends over, the others hide, and the one who is bent over needs to seek the others until he finds all those that have hidden. So it's known as hide and seek. But I find it interesting that the author finds it necessary to describe exactly how the game is played, and maybe he's not sure about the name of the game, but it is interesting that here, and as well as in other places, writers go into detail to describe exactly how the game is played, which I think is very telling in the way that adults, rabbinical authorities, writers paid attention to the way children played or remembered from their own childhood the rules of the games. So it gives us the feeling that this was not something that was overlooked by adults or seen as an important or of no meaning or of no cultural importance. On the contrary, we see here an attempt to understand, describe, document the ways children played. Often for halachic reasons, they had to discuss the details, but nevertheless, they were familiar with them. As opposed to other cases that we know about women's customs, for instance, where they say the details are known to women. This is something that women do, and we do not know exactly the details. Here, they say we're familiar with this. We see it. We know what it is. And I think that this is an interesting point here. So we started from infants and we went on to children. And the last story might have already dealt with young adults. But most of the games that we saw so far were, I would say, benign, right? They did not disturb the public order. They might be problematic on a halachic, from a halachic point of view, but they're not, I would say, disturbing in any other way. When we reach young adults, youth, and I will only give a glimpse here into their world, because this is a whole different thing, and we have many other customs and issues that arise from the way that young people went around. But we will see here, I think, the difference between the way that children's play was understood and young adults or youth play was understood and framed. Okay. So this is from the regulations from the community of Altona, the 18th century, the beginning of the 18th century, today part of the city of Hamburg. And these are all kinds of games, such as card games and even Kugel und Kegel, this is bowling, games are absolutely forbidden. Okay, so during the year, or generally speaking, it's absolutely forbidden to play games which, and the main reason is that they involve gambling, money. These are absolutely forbidden. But on Hanukkah and Purim, each can be played for that 1 week. But a woman, married or unmarried, may not play with the head of a household or a single man, and certainly not with a non-Jew. So here we already, this involves adults mostly, but I would like to argue that the specific mention of unmarried women and single men is sort of, and this, you would have to see the entire regulations to see that this is a recurring theme, referring to the behavior of young people, both in the way they dress and the way they behave. That this regulation was specifically concerned with these unmarried young people, who we can assume were more likely to play these games, which were allowed on this 1 week during the holidays of Hanukkah and Purim, probably again to increase the happiness that needs to take place on these holidays, and therefore it was allowed during these days. And again, I apologize for the quality, but this is, will have to believe me that I've done my best here. If you can look closely at this depiction of Jewish children playing during the holidays. You can indeed see them playing bowling here. You can see the ball and the cones here. The children here, I imagine you can't see it, but they're playing with a spinning top, which is similar to playing with cards or with cubes, because this is also a game that you play for gambling. Of course, what we know today as the Sevivon or the dreidel, associated mostly with Hanukkah, but this is a very popular game that is played for money. I call this the Jewish children's games, but this is not as rich, obviously, as Poigel or as amusing, but nevertheless, we see children playing with 2 or 3 different kinds of games in this illustration. So we can see that the visual sources, the visual depictions are in line also with some of the text. So we can see that they're talking about similar activities, similar games, and the popularity of these games. So Purim and Hanukkah were two events that sparked much joy and happiness. The third one was Simchat Torah, both the nature of the holiday and rejoicing, the finishing of a cycle of reading of the Torah, and also as the last holiday in the series of holidays of the month of Tishrei, a holiday of much joy and happiness. We saw how children were given fruit and nuts. What did young people do on Simchat Torah? Fruits and nuts were obviously not enough for them. And I return here to the Maharil, to the 15th century. I'm reading. The Mahari Segal said that the practice of young men to take the wood covering the sukkah and light a fire on Simchat Torah is a good practice for Yom Tov joy. But this is an inappropriate thing for adults to do, to take apart the sukkah and make a fire. Okay, and here in the parenthesis is a testimony about the Maharil himself. And I, who am but a gleaner in the words of the great, saw my father, the Mahari Segal, take great joy and pleasure in watching the young men run from house to house on Simchat Torah to take apart and plunder the planks from the sukkah and bring the wood to make a fire. And he himself allowed them to take from his sukkah and incited them to plunder the wood from those who didn't want to give them to them. So what we see here is almost carnivalesque, or as carnivalesque as early modern Jews get, where young people we can, and I think this description we can actually is very sort of vivid. We can see these young boys running from one sukkah to the other and tearing them down, taking the wood and then adding it to the big fire and probably almost burning down the whole Jewish quarter or something. And those who want to hold on to their sukkot or their wood or their goods or whatever the young people are taking, objecting, and there's always those adults who do not want to participate. And there are always those adults who want to join the young people and do the same. And the Maharil, again, and this goes back to where we started, makes this distinction between what is appropriate for adults to do on the holiday, which is rejoice in different ways. We can see in other sources, they eat and drink and dance, but they do not make bonfires. They do not tear down sukkot. They're supposed to find other sources of happiness. Well, the young boys, the young men need to find something more exciting, I would say, and he encourages them to do so, and doesn't let others stand in their way to their happiness and joy on the holiday. So I would like to conclude here and go back to where we started. That I hope I convinced you here that the sources or the little sources that we have, we have to admit we don't have many sources about children's games, but I think we can see that there are a few recurring themes here that go along and can show us that there's a consistent way of talking about children's culture and what is appropriate for children and how children normally and usually behave. There's definitely an understanding that children are different from adults and have their own ways of celebrating and being happy on the holidays and keeping the holidays in their way. We see that there's an attempt to contain it within the halachic, the cultural, the legal norms, but with some flexibility around it because of this understanding of what is appropriate for children and what is appropriate in general. We see a way to make it, there's an attempt to make a distinction between children and adults. There's a clear understanding that there's a line here where childhood ends and adulthood begins, and children and adults act and associate in different ways. And we also see that although Jewish children played in ways and used objects as children in many cultures, we have found some of these objects in pre-Columbian societies and in diggings in Europe and in the Far East and in the Middle East. Nevertheless, many of these games are contextualized within a specific Jewish context, within the specific understanding or interpretation of Jewish culture in the context of the holidays, and are not just some kind of general behavior of children, but rather formulated in a Jewish context. So I would like to thank you for your attention. And I believe we have time for some questions. And I'm happy to hear from you and your remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Berner. Jennifer asked, is there any evidence of games specific to girls?
That's a good question. Okay, so we saw girls mentioned in some of these texts, right? With the nuts, yeah, that boys and girls play with nuts. And of course with the card games on Purim and Hanukkah. There's another source that I didn't bring here that discusses whether it is allowed to use leftover parchment from writing to make crowns that girls played with as brides or as queens. As we know, brides and queens are sort of there's one universal toy that was missing from this lecture. If you were paying close attention, if boys play with balls, girls play with dolls, right? Dolls are not mentioned, or at least would not found them yet in Jewish sources before the 16th century, and it's a big question whether the second commandment was observed in a way that girls did not have dolls. I somehow find it hard to believe, but it is a fact that dolls are not mentioned. Other than that, we saw that on the holiday of Simchat Torah, when children collect fruits and nuts, we also see there are also girls depicted there. So we might assume that boys and girls, at least until a certain age, play together, play the same games. But otherwise, I can't say more about girls in particular. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Victor asked, is there any evidence that Jewish game playing for children was fundamentally different than Christian children?
I can't say that it was fundamentally different. No, they share the same culture, as we know. Definitely the same material culture. But I would say that the context is different. The days, the times, the questions that arise from certain activities were different. I have not come across any mention of Christian and Jewish children playing together, although we cannot rule it out completely. We can assume that when Christian children played, going to church. Jewish children played going to the synagogue, or when they put up a wedding scene, those looked different. But we might also not have enough evidence to actually answer this question in a sufficient way, I would say. This is more or less what we have. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Julie asks, were the women's activities not described because they didn't know or didn't care, or why?
Oh, yeah, that was my remark about children, the way they're familiar with children's culture as opposed to what they're familiar with women. It's a good question. We don't quite know whether the legal authorities, rabbis, did not want to sort of infringe upon or get involved in certain women's customs that they saw as women's, I would say, own sphere, or and they might have not been familiar, especially with things that had to do with childbirth. They were just, it seemed they were kept away, and they really did not know certain things. Certain things I think they did not want to get involved in. They didn't see it as part of their authority. Yeah, but they're experts on that. Yeah.
Thank you. Daniel writes, regarding Jewish material culture, are there any preserved toys from the medieval or early modern period in museum collections?
Thank you. I wanted to say that earlier on. Not that we know of. We do not know of objects that specifically belong to Jewish children. But maybe if you ask me in a year or two, these things are changing now. They're digging now in different places, and they're finding more and more objects that we assume belong to Jews. There's a lot going on in the city of Cologne and Köln in Germany. They're digging stuff, and there's amazing stuff coming out from there from the Middle Ages, like early on. But no, we are not. I cannot say that a certain object was used by a Jewish child, I guess before the maybe second half of the 18th century or something. But I would also say that a lot of the material object that we do have comes from England. The Brits were good with preserving their material culture and documents in general. And as we know, Jews were expelled from England early on. But I'm not aware of anything that has been associated with a Jewish child in particular yet.
So children tend to play with whatever's around. So I mean, you put them in a garden, and they'll find a stick and pretend it's something else, and make a game of it, and so on. So is it possible that it was just so commonplace that it wasn't worth mentioning, aside from the holidays that were so different than others, that there were halachic laws about what to play and how and when?
Yeah, that was a question, or I'm sorry.
Yes, I mean, is it possible that it was just so commonplace that there was no reason to mention it in any of the texts that you mentioned?
Yes, I was just I was when I want to go back to the question about the material culture and what we found. What we can maybe was used or held or a document that we know that was made by children. We have from the Cairo Geniza. There are a few drawings and attempts to copy letters that were probably made by children. And again, in Cologne, we somebody, the people working on that, they showed me something that was probably drawn by a child. So we might have, in terms of material culture, we might have something that was made by a child. Yes, in a way. Yeah.
Thank you. Tirza writes, in the Jewish neighborhood of Amsterdam, toys have been found in archaeological digs. That's a comment. And in the chat, there are many compliments and thank yous. Thank you very much, Dr. Berner, and everyone have a wonderful holiday, and Laila Tov from Jerusalem.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This was amazing. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Very interesting.
Great to
Thank
hear.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tali.
Nice to
Thank
see
you.
you.
Thank your parents for inviting us. It's really wonderful to hear.
Thank you, Gloria.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Welcome.
I wanted to also say, you know, my father told me in their small, tiny town in Eastern Europe and Belarus, they used nature's toys, rocks, sticks. Maybe they had a ball. I never asked him, but that's what I asked him, you know, that they used to play a game like jacks with rocks. And they had marbles.
Yes, marbles. My great grandfather immigrated from Belarus area. I remember him speaking of marbles.
Thanks, Tali. I really enjoyed it. And it seems like there were a lot of interesting games that I just didn't know about. So in early childhood. So I thank you.
Somebody's
His audio was not good.
yeah.
Victor, you can't be heard. Your audio is not good.
Okay, thank you all very, very much. Have a Laila Tov and Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach. Thank you.
Chag Sameach.
Sameach, Yasher Koach.
Thank you.